Esteemed chair of this academic session, Dr. KTS Sarang, conference participants, members of the audience, I would like to thank Dr. Siddharth Singh and Dr. Ujjwal Kumar for inviting me to this conference. I would also like to thank the Mahabodhi Society of India for sponsoring this wonderful event. In the classroom at my college hangs a Tibetan Buddhist thangka dedicated to Padmasambhava, who is credited with introducing Buddhism into Tibet. Guru Rinpoche appears in his rainbow body at the center of this thangka. In a course I teach on Buddhist traditions of Tibet and the Himalayas, I begin by asking my students to study and spend time examining this artifact as an entrance into the Buddhist religion. So their initial introduction is through art and aesthetics. As an art object, the thangka is not only aesthetically pleasing, but also might serve as a metaphor for Buddhism itself. Used as an object for teaching and meditation, thangkas are elaborate, but also light and easy to carry. And even on a lengthy trip, thangkas are portable, and in a curious way, I would argue that Buddhism is also portable, perhaps the most portable of all global religions. One of Buddhism's great strengths is its simplicity. One doesn't even need to write down its basic truths. One can easily memorize and carry them in one's mind from place to place. And thus, Buddhism seems ideally suited to today's itinerant, quickly changing world. Several centuries after the Buddha's death, the home base of this future global religion appeared destined for the Indian subcontinent. In the 3rd century BCE, almost the entirety of India and parts of present-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh were unified under the enlightened rule of Ashoka. This benevolent emperor so impressed India's Prime Minister, Nehru, that he chose the Ashokan Dharma Chakra to place in the center of India's independent flag, and his 3-pillar lion as the national symbol. Ashoka took the simple truths of Buddhism, converted them into edicts, strategically positioned next to roadsides across India as reminders to its citizens. These rocks and pillars survive, of course, to this day and may be viewed in Sarnath, New Delhi, Sanchi, and elsewhere. Ashoka also aimed to transport the Dharma beyond his imperial borders and thus send missionaries abroad, including his own son to what is now Sri Lanka. As a result, this enlightened ruler is still revered today in India and elsewhere. In his book, Ashoka, The Search for India's Lost Emperor, John Allen writes, quote, Ashoka's song has survived the vicissitudes of some 2,270 years. And yet, for all his brave words, and despite all the Buddhist tales about Dharmashoka, the wheel-turning monarch, the man himself remains intangible, more myth than real personage. Among the myths surrounding Ashoka, not least, is what brought his enlightened rule in India to an end. No doubt there are many factors that led to Buddhism's decline in India. After his death, Ashoka's empire began to gradually crumble, and Buddhism's hold on the populace began to atrophy as well. We know from 2 Buddhist pilgrims from China, one in the 5th century CE, the other some 200 years later, that by the 7th century, many of the shrines were in ruins, and Buddhists were actually being persecuted in Kashmir and Bengal. Buddhism, however, didn't die at this point. This resilient, portable religion was transported along the Silk Road and reached China by the 4th century, Korea by the 5th, and Japan by the 6th. By the 8th century, the refurbished brand of Buddhism, known as Mahayana, had taken root in Nepal and Tibet as well. Theravada, the more austere version of the religion, also proved resilient and was transplanted throughout Southeast Asia. Looking back, it appears that Ashoka's near unification of the entire subcontinent might be responsible for the evolution of Buddhism into a global religion. Ashoka may well have done for Buddhism what Constantine did for Christianity when he consolidated the Roman Empire and converted. Like Constantine, Ashoka was a convert and brought a convert's dedication, fervent belief, and sense of urgency to establishing the empire's religious identity. In doing so, Ashoka, like Constantine, transformed their respective religions. Even after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the foundation was laid for the spread of Christianity to the rest of Europe, the West, and eventually all corners of the globe. Likewise, for many years, after the disintegration of Ashoka's empire, Indian sages based in Nalanda and elsewhere continued to plant seeds, inspiring followers in Tibet and throughout the Himalayas. Monks from Tibet later went on missions, carrying their teachings throughout China, creating the groundwork for cross-fertilization, as Gray Tuttle has argued in his book, Tibetan Buddhists and the Making of Modern China. Scholars from Japan, such as Saicho and Kukai, traveled to China to become adept in the Chan tradition, which they helped to evolve into Zen and spread throughout Japan, beginning in the 6th century CE. A little later, Huan Song returned to China from his lengthy pilgrimage in India with sacred Buddhist texts, which he spent the rest of his life translating and teaching. And as Pankaj Mishra reminds us, Buddhism was the state religion of China by the 7th century, when Huan Song brought back rare manuscripts from India. Buddhism's foothold in East and Southeast Asia was established based on the foundation laid by Ashoka. Unlike some other world religions, however, Buddhism's path to global recognition did not follow a smooth trajectory. For centuries, this portable religion seemed destined to remain regional and distinctly Asian in makeup, and even there, its ascendancy was far from certain. In 9th century China, Mishra reminds us, the disgruntled followers of Confucius and Lao Tzu had finally succeeded in driving Buddhism out from official favor. And by the 13th century, Buddhism had been almost totally eradicated from the Indian subcontinent, superseded by the rise of Hinduism and Islamic raiders from the north. King Kanishka of Gandhara is probably the second most important ruler in India, and evidence points out that Buddhism and Buddhist art flourished during his rule. Gandharan art has proven to be a lasting art form still seen today, and interestingly, Gandharan art displayed a distinct Greek influence, indicating that the contact with Europe through the abortive invasion by Alexander the Great extended beyond the military realm into culture and art. And that influence proved to be lasting. If Buddhism in India was undone by Muslim invasion from the north and the growth of Hinduism on the subcontinent, this led ironically to another way that Buddhism persisted. According to Noble Ross Reed, Shankara, founder of the school of Hinduism known as Advaita or non-dual Vedanta, showed marked similarity in his thought to Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka Buddhism. Shankara was sometimes chided by his rivals, who referred to him as a surreptitious Buddhist. Thus, Buddhism persisted in India through its influence on the majority religion. This influence has continued right up to Gandhi, whose practice of ahimsa deeply affected his politics. Gandhi acknowledges the Buddhist influence on his thinking in his autobiography. Many scholars believe that Buddhism lost sway in India because it became too insular, too involved with monastic life and centers of learning, and lost connection with the communal life of the people. But paradoxically, it was from those centers of learning that its message was transported so effectively. By the 5th century, the pilgrim Fa Hsien reported that Nalanda was one of the finest institutions of higher learning in the world, with a library housed in 3 multi-story buildings and an enrollment of several thousand monk students representing all schools of Buddhism and governed by strict admission procedures and academic standards. Huan Song, the 7th century pilgrim, studied at Nalanda for 5 years, and it was at this university that Tilopa and Naropa taught students, including ones from Tibet, who would go on to transmit their influence back home. Beginning in the 8th century, as Buddhist monks from India began a gradual exodus to China, Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan, the Himalayas, and Tibet, they cast a unifying influence on the continent as a whole. Of all the migrations that Buddhism took from its home base in India, 2 stand out as especially significant. The transmission to Tibet and to Japan. Both religions went through a similar evolution, but the traditions that emerged were different. Nevertheless, in both cases, the Buddhism that emerged proved ready for export to the West. This version of Buddhism that reached Tibet in the 8th century was Mahayana. And the esoteric Vajrayana branch of Mahayana was developed significantly in Tibet. Buddhism's encounter with the natural deities observed in Tibet long before its arrival, and also by the shamanistic Bon religion, gave it a distinctive shape. Rather than simply replace these prior spiritual beliefs, Tibetan Buddhism incorporated them. Tibet's remote, mountainous geographical location and its high altitude insulated it from outside influences for centuries. But following his victory in the Chinese Civil War, Mao Zedong, with the People's Liberation Army, invaded, with catastrophic results for Tibetan Buddhists. The Chinese destruction of monasteries and the Tamzing public struggle sessions were so brutal that John Powers has compared this historic period to the Nazi campaign against Jews in Poland and Germany during World War II. Buddhism arrived in Japan earlier than it did in Tibet, and by the 8th century was already established as the state religion. Prince Shotoku, who might be considered the Ashoka of Japan, played a key role in establishing Mahayana Buddhism in that society. In order to do so, he had to show how previous Shinto beliefs could be merged with the new religion. Unlike Tibetan Buddhism, which traced its lineage back to India, Japan looked back to the example of China and their traditions, which had merged with Confucianism and Taoism. Just as in the case of Tibetan Buddhism, the development of the religion in Japan would not be free of obstacles. By the end of the Edo period, Buddhism and Shintoism were increasingly seen as distinct, and the emperor embraced the latter, creating active exclusion and resistance to Buddhism from the mid-19th century until the end of World War II. Although the effect was not as catastrophic as Mao's invasion of Tibet, it diminished Buddhism's role in Japanese culture. The religion known as Zen that emerged in Japan represents a unique version of global Buddhism, and one which has had considerable influence. In Chinese and Japanese Buddhism, according to Peter Matheson, only a few bodhisattvas and the historical Shakyamuni are commonly portrayed, and the Chan or Zen sect, in particular, has cut away most iconography, in keeping with the spare, clear, simple style. In its effort to avoid religiosity, to encourage free thinking and doubt, Zen makes bold use of contradictions, humor, and irreverence, applauding the monk who burned up the wood altar Buddha to keep warm. As a result of its unique development, Japanese Zen is very different from Theravada traditions of Southeast Asia and the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions of Tibet and the Himalayas. Some commentators have wondered, given the variety of practices among all these schools, if these varying traditions are actually part of the same religion. The answer to that question lies in the unusual developments that took place in India in the early 19th century. Of all the strange twists taken by Buddhism on its way to becoming a widely recognized global religion, surely the most ironic is its rediscovery on the Indian subcontinent. They are members of the British civil service, such as James Prinsep and Alexander Cunningham, began to take a keen interest in temple ruins, old coins, and artifacts that did not appear to belong to any existing tradition. After painstaking work, Prinsep and Cunningham began to amass evidence of a powerful ruler who erected giant pillars and left large stone surfaces covered with indecipherable script. Prinsep eventually cracked the code and designated the script Ashoka Brahmin, named after the ruler that the amateur archaeologists had rediscovered. In short, Buddhism at this time was known only in Asia and remained unknown in the West. Sites such as Bodh Gaya had been taken over by Hinduism, and its rightful possession would only be decided in court. Nevertheless, Buddhist pilgrims across Asia had continued to make the journey to sites such as Bodh Gaya, which shows the underlying unification of the religion. The findings of these British civil servants would eventually be shared at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893 by Asian Buddhists, such as Anagarika Dharmapala. One could argue the events at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 as a reversal of fortune for this long-forgotten religion and its inception as a recognized global religion. If we return briefly to the Tibetan thangka back on my American campus, we find at its center Padmasambhava, who made a prophecy back in the 8th century. Quote, "When the iron bird flies and horses run on wheels, the Tibetan people will be scattered like ants across the face of the earth, and the Dharma will come to the land of the red men." If we take the land of the red men to be America, then it is hard to argue with Guru Rinpoche's prophecy, and this sets up a final irony, as explained by John Powers. Quote, "Due to the diaspora of the Tibetan people brought about by the invasion and occupation of Tibet by China, today Tibetan culture and religion are being spread all over the world, with the result that Tibetan culture is attracting unprecedented attention outside its homeland, at the same time that it is being systematically eradicated in the land of its origin." One can find evidence of this unprecedented attention in a growing number of Buddhist temples and learning centers today throughout the U.S. Buddhist centers affiliated with Japanese Zen can also be readily found in the States, Canada, and of course Europe and Australia. The global migration of Buddhist monastic institutions has been so great, according to Todd Lewis, that a representative of every major Asian school can now be found on every continent, and numerous non-Asians have by now been accepted for ordination as monks and nuns in every nation's Sangha. In addition, awareness of the basic Buddhist doctrines of karma, nirvana, and Buddhahood, formerly confined to the educated classes of the world, is now accessible to all via the global mass media. Every religion has ways of making its presence known. Bells toll every Sunday morning announcing Christian worship. The muezzin calls the Muslim faithful 5 times daily over loudspeakers. Hindu temples utilize loudspeakers to broadcast prayers and devotional music. Of all the world religions, Buddhism, despite its affinity for ringing bells and blowing horns, appears to be the quietest, giving it a relatively muted presence in most locations.
Ek Sahib, Baba Sahib, Ek Sahib.